very welcome to what is a very special, for me, a very special edition of History Now. We've reached episode 100 and I have a very special guest today, and I can't think of nobody better to mark this 100th episode than my guest. He has written, edited upwards of 30 books. He is the subject of a number of academic books. He has collaborated with Prince, among other people, and has been in 2 of the Matrix movies. So it is my absolute honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Cornel West to the show. Professor West, you're very welcome.
I am blessed and delighted. In fact, it's an honor to be recorded with my dear brother Barry for the 100th episode in his History Now.
I've been a big fan of yours for a long time, and I think most people know you as a philosopher and political commentator. But what has attracted my eye is how much your work is rooted in history and historical knowledge and historicism. So I would just like to ask you a few questions about the role history plays in your work.
Sure.
And life. And just to begin with, can we talk about your background in, the Black Church, the Shiloh Baptist Church? I've heard you in the past say that it was a church in which the problem of evil is confronted and social misery is central. Now, that says to me that, there's a historical awareness in this institution of the Black experience in America. But coupled with that, you said that, the Black Panthers were literally next door with their breakfast program and things like that. In that environment, how did that, enhance your awareness of the importance of history?
Well, first, I want to salute you, though, brother, for you being such a force for good in the world, your scholarship and the work that you're doing there at the university and PhD program. And second, I want to note the ways in which there's significant overlap in precious Irish brothers and sisters and their struggle for freedom, and precious Black brothers and sisters and our struggle for freedom. Our African liberation flag has a green in it, and that green stands for Ireland. A lot of people don't know that Marcus Garvey, when he put that flag together, coming from Jamaica, he had spent good time both in Britain, had close relations with the Irish freedom fighters in London. And that green in the African liberation flag, which serves as a flag in the United States for the Black freedom movement, has Ireland right there as a constitutive feature, a constitutive element. So it's very, very important that we begin with that historical note. Now, in terms of my own life, I grew up on the chocolate side, the Black side of Sacramento, California. The highest honor I've ever had in my life is being the second son of Irene and Clifton West, my father and my mother. I'll never be half the person that they were. I have a deep sense of loyalty to family. I wouldn't be who I am without their love and their unbelievable support. And it went hand in hand with Shiloh Baptist Church, which is right next to the Black Panther Party. So on the one hand, I heard in the Black Baptist Church, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. Then right next door, we had the Black Panther Party saying, when you talk about the least of these in Matthew 25, it means the poor, it means the oppressed, it means the subjugated, it means the persecuted, that they're subjects in history. They've been viewed as if they're only objects in history, but no, they're subjects in history. We can make our history out of self-respect, self-determination, and self-defense. And I took that very, very seriously. So when I went to college at Harvard, PhD in philosophy at Princeton, I always carried with that. You carry with me that decolonizing sensibility, that attempt to always remember, to revere, but also to resist in the name of a better world for everybody. So it begins with the particularity of my own roots, R-O-O-T-S, but it takes me in an internationalism with a R-O-U-T-E-S. I love that interplay of roots and routes that you get in my dear brother Paul Gilroy's classic Black Atlantic. I take that very seriously. So in this regard, history really sits at the center. But I should also say that I'm a blues man, and which means that when you're in time, you're in history, you're dealing with structures of domination, you're dealing with forms of oppression. And it looks as if at times that there's a terrible paucity of alternatives. It looks as if it's hard for fundamental transformation to be taken seriously as a vision, as an analysis. And therefore, you have to be able to be a long distance runner. And it's here, well, I must say that I take very seriously my dear brother Samuel Beckett. Try again, fail again, fail better. Try again, fail again, fail better. Now, Chekhov in many ways is my soulmate. And I view Beckett building on Chekhov in a number of different ways with that rich Irish twist to it, with that fascinating sense of the comic and the sense of living in the midst of the tensions and incongruities, but keeping on. It's a blues-like sensibility, it's tragic comic to the core. That's what brings together the blues, Beckett, and Chekhov.
You mentioned there you went to Harvard. When you were in Harvard, you focused on philosophy, but then later on you brought in history. And in your book, The Ethical Dimensions of Marxist Thought, you chart Marx's movement from philosophy to incorporating history too. Is there any way that, you know, his evolution mirrors your own?
Very much so that, you know, Marx wrote an essay when he was very young called Jesus Christ in Solidarity with the Oppressed of the World, a kind of a prefiguration of liberation theology. He was a Jew by origin, deep, rich Jewish tradition he comes out of, rabbinical tradition of his family. He was Protestant by upbringing. His father had converted to Protestantism. And of course, he chose to be secular. He chose to be atheistic. But he had tremendous prophetic sensibility. And by prophetic, what I mean is a hypersensitivity to the suffering of oppressed people in Europe and all around the world. And so I've always wanted to be in close conversation with not just Marx, but the Marxist tradition that goes all the way through to Lukács, Antonio Gramsci, C.L.R. James, Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, a whole host of different Marxist thinkers. And of course, Ireland has its own rich tradition as well. But for me, as a revolutionary Christian, I always wanted to keep the focus on not just these structures of domination and resistance, but also on the moral and spiritual dimensions of that resistance. Marx himself tended to downplay the psychic and the spiritual and the moral. Whereas for me, like you say, in ethical dimensions, when I was just a young brother and studying the whole Marxist corpus, as well as Kautsky and Lukács and Engels in that book, that I was concerned about the ethical dimension of the Marxist project. The kinds of virtues of integrity, courage, of moral consistency, of sensitivity, the things that Marx tended just to take for granted. He just assumed, in fact, that working people would have a certain kind of sensitivity to suffering, not simply of themselves, but of other working people and other working people around the world, that kind of internationalism. That is one of the great virtues of any Marxist project. But that's the way, as we know, that was, World War I. The Marxist parties went with under the national flag, the national banner. The internationalism was radically called into question. And that's something that I think we have to acknowledge, that the national context is very important. I mean, Ireland must come to terms with British colonialism for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Black people must come to terms with white supremacy and American apartheid and Jim Crow and Jane Crow and the new Jim Crow and so forth. But we also have to have solidarity. That's why our identities, Irish identities, Black identities, it must be grounded in a moral integrity and a global solidarity.
Your 2014 book, Black Prophetic Fire, deals with a lot of people who, such as Ida B. Wells, Malcolm X, of course, you've got Martin Luther King, you've got Frederick Douglass, who a portrait of him hangs up in the City Hall in Belfast.
Wow.
You've got a lot of people here, and that's what I wanted to ask. These people that you're analysing in this book and your other works, the international dimension, how important is that to you, that the people that you look at have this really strong international, imprint in their day and, after their day?
That is so very, very important. I didn't know about Brother Frederick Douglass hanging in the City Hall of Belfast, though.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he came to Belfast just before he left Ireland, and it was unveiled a couple of years ago.
Isn't that something? You know, I find it very interesting now that the first book ever written by me was written by a brilliant young Irish sister named Rosemary Cohen. And it was a PhD program at Queen's University at Belfast. And when she first sent me the manuscript, you know, I was so, and I remain so honored that such a visionary and courageous voice like hers, I'm sure it's very similar to yours in a number of different ways, would choose my work as a work to spend so much time on and to write this marvelous book so that again, you can see the Irish Black solidarity at work. And it's that kind of solidarity across national borders, a kind of global, international coming together that is so important because it gives all of us hope. You know, if we remain tied into just our very narrow national context, we wonder how can we engage in not just a refusal and a no to oppression, to greed, to hatred, to indifference, to callousness, those hounds of hell that all of us have to come to terms with on earth, but also the fact that there's other people in other corners of the globe who are struggling in their own distinctive ways. We learn from each other, we're inspired from each other, and then we can make close connection with each other. When I got a chance, when she came here to Harvard, and we got a chance to meet and we talked, and then she got a job in Philadelphia. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to see this kind of Black Irish solidarity flowering and flourishing.
I want to talk about someone who I know has had a deep impact on you intellectually, and that's W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
Can you tell us what he means to you as an intellectual? Because, you know, he's a novelist, a historian, a sociologist. You know, it's breathtaking, you know, diversity of work that he did.
No, it's true. No, W.B. Du Bois, he is the greatest public intellectual to ever emerge out of the U.S. empire. And he's got some serious competitors. I mean, Ralph Waldo Emerson was a great one. Walt Whitman was a great one. Reinhold Niebuhr was a great one. Susan Sontag was a great one. But something about W.B. Du Bois, because he was able to bring together a critique of empire. For the most part, the United States lives in a world of denial when it comes to its own empire. Most intellectuals don't make a connection between a critique of racism, let's say, and a critique of imperialism, or a critique of sexism and a critique of empire. But Du Bois was able to embrace all of those, and he was willing to pay a major cost. You know, he's living there in Brooklyn. They've taken his passport. He was trashed. He was demonized. He was underwent vast character assassination. Here he was, the first PhD from Harvard in 1895. He was expected to fit in the system. He had access to all of the benefits of the mainstream, but out of sheer intellectual integrity, out of sheer courage, and most importantly, out of his love for poor people and working people, he was willing to pick up his cross in the biblical sense, which is to say he was willing to be true to his calling. He would never sell his soul for a mess of pottage. I love that about W.B. Du Bois. That's why I teach him every year.
Yeah.
I teach him every year.
Of course, there's someone that we all know, and perhaps we don't know, is probably a better way of putting it, and you address this in your book, and that's Martin Luther King Jr. You've rightly called him a complete freedom fighter, but also interestingly, and I think a lot of people are guilty of this, is that they, you know, impose their own values on him, what they think he was. And what I want to ask is, you know, the term civil rights leader, it's so broad. It's, you know, it's almost like a blank canvas that's inviting people to put their own values on him. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, you recall at the very end of his life, he had tears in his eyes, and he said, the sad thing is that people never really knew me. Didn't know who I was, didn't know what my calling was. They thought I was a narrow civil rights activist. They thought I was concerned just about breaking the back of American apartheid, American Jim Crow in the South. And they didn't realize that, in fact, from the very beginning, back in 1952, he was a follower of Norman Thomas, who was head of the Socialist Party. When he met his wife, Coretta Scott King, she said, I never met a Black socialist in my life. Martin was already a socialist. What does he mean by being a socialist? Well, he was a Christian who believed that by focusing on the least of these, on those Franz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, that you will end up calling for democratic controls, not just in the ballot box lifting voices, but at the workplace, that there would be a democratizing of society in such a way that it would look very much like a democratic socialist society. It would be a critique of empire. Now, he did finally reach that point in his critique of the Vietnam War, of course, and that's where he was willing, again, like Du Bois, pay a major cost, Brother Barry. Trash, death threats, misunderstood, black bourgeoisie turn against him. New York Times turns against him. Washington Post turns against him. Life magazine turns against him. They say he's just an echo of communist Hanoi, as if somehow his critique of the Vietnam War and the barbarity of those U.S. Those U.S. bombs on precious innocent Vietnamese babies and men and women, as if his concern about them made him some kind of authoritarian communist. It was just another smear campaign against the brother. And when he died, 72% of Americans disapproved of him, and over 50% of Black people disapproved of him. He was trying to bring all poor people together in the Poor People's Campaign and critique of American empire. That was too much for the mainstream. It was just too much for the mainstream. And if he had lived, I think, like Du Bois, he would have been pushed to the margins. He would have been pushed to the fringes because he had too much truth. America couldn't bear his truth.
It's very interesting because, when I was doing my history degree, one of my lecturers talked about one of the last campaigns Martin Luther King was involved in, that was sanitation, men who were on strike. And what's really interesting in that book is, and it really pricked up my ears, is you say, all these things that he's not, but figures that he is like, and this is what's fascinating to me. You talked about Jim Larkin in the 1913 Dublin lockout, the Labour.
Yeah.
It's that side that I think that people don't understand about Martin Luther King.
You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And I'm glad you made that point about who he was working with and marching with and learning from in Memphis when he was shot down like a dog. It was those precious sanitation workers. Those precious sanitation workers, a trade union movement that was trying to bring Black and white workers together. It's too often in America, the trade union movement has still been racist. It's been a very important force for progress, but when it was racist, it meant that it was still contributing to the worst of the status quo, even as it was trying to bring some power and pressure to bear against the bosses, against capital. And Martin Luther King Jr. always believed in the dignity of the labor movement, all workers of all colors. And that was something else that got him in trouble, because for a lot of Black liberals, Black centrists, they didn't want a class analysis. They just wanted inclusion in a capitalist hierarchy, inclusion within an imperial hierarchy. They wanted Black faces in high places rather than a democratizing of a hierarchy that would allow for poor and working people to gain access to resources and wealth and more respect.
Something that I think that a lot of people, if you ask them, especially this side of the Atlantic, name some African-American, iconic figures, they'll automatically say Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, or Du Bois. But, I think it's a certain amount of misogyny going on. We're not mentioning any of the female, Black leaders like Bwales, and I want to talk about her. Can you tell people who she was and why she was important to you?
Well, I think she's one of the most brilliant and courageous of Black freedom fighters in the history of America, because she was the one who targeted the most vicious forms of American terrorism. Her book, A Red Terror, she wrote a number of different pieces keeping track of the lynching, keeping track of the brutalizing of Black folk. And this is at a time in which both Du Bois on the one hand, Booker T. Washington on the other were the two most towering figures. But she, as a woman, founder of the Black Women's Club, founder of Black Women's Organization, Sunday school teacher in Chicago, she still had a strong Christian faith. She had to be critical of Du Bois. She had to be critical of Booker T. Washington because they were not taking the terrorism head on. Now, this is in Du Bois's earlier period. He was then more of a kind of progressive liberal at that time. He becomes a Marxist later on in his life. But Ida B. Wells, when she takes on the terrorism head on, and when she takes on the working conditions of Black women, and at that time, the vast majority of Black women, like my precious grandmother, were domestic maids in white households, raising white children, and then going home and raising their own children. And they were often, as you can imagine, subject to ugly sexual violation and sexual harassment and rape and so forth. And she was raising those issues. Those are issues of workplace safety and dignity at the workplace. It just happened to be the Black women workplace for the most part were white households. So she was bringing together labor questions. She was bringing together the white supremacist terrorism. And she had her own critiques of American imperialism too, in the Philippines, in Guam, in Hawaii, in Cuba, and Puerto Rico. So that she ought to be a household name, just like Martin Luther King Jr. I would say the same thing about Ella Baker.
Yeah, and that's someone else you addressed.
Yes,
Ella Baker.
That's why I include her in that book too. Executive director of both Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with Stokely Carmichael and John Lewis and Diane Nash and James Lawson and so many others. So that you're right, the narrow patriarchal lens through which we look at any movement needs to be shattered.
In terms of another thing that I think people don't appreciate is the diversity among these voices that you look at. Perhaps we see it as, and they are doing this, in the various ways, are drawing attention to, the plight of Black people in America. But the voices in those are something I think people perhaps don't appreciate. And you look at that, there's a wonderful term you use, and it's about historicize. And once you historicize, you pluralize. So this idea of, the people coming into conflict with each other, but at the end of the day, they're looking at similar things.
Absolutely.
Is that still a problem where people, tend to look at, say, for the want of a better term, the Black community, and just think they're all one voice?
Absolutely. I mean, the problem is once you look at any person or group of persons as abstractions, then you're likely to homogenize. And when you homogenize, you downplay or you render invisible people's specificity, individuality, and the variety of any community. So anytime you talk about Black people, no such thing as the Black community, because when you historicize, you contextualize. When you contextualize, you pluralize. And that community has so many different streams and strands and different voices and different classes, different genders, different sexual orientation. So generally speaking, there's such a thing as the Black community, but as soon as you begin to speak concretely, you got to zero in on the distinctive features of which slice of that community you're really talking about. And once you give up on homogenizing, once you give up on viewing people as a monolith and view them in their distinctiveness, then you're able to acknowledge the possibility of genuine connection, genuine organization, genuine affiliation. People do come together. People choose to fight together. People struggle together. They love together. They laugh together. But they do it as fleshified, concrete, singular persons who are shaped by families, communities, heritages, and histories. And so again, the historicizing is so very important. But once you do that, then you got to be willing to get very, very concrete.
And if I may, this is something that you look at in the paradox of the Afro-American Rebellion article that you've written about Martin Luther King criticizing the older generation. It's, you know, and it shows a radical side of him too. That's, you know, I don't think too many people appreciate.
But God, you've done so much reading, my dear brother. I appreciate that. I hadn't thought about that essay in a long time. But absolutely right, that King's willingness to bring critique to bear on the worst of his elders, because he wants to learn from the best of his elders. But the worst of his elders, too many of them are just too willing to be well-adjusted to injustice. They're trying to fit in. He wants a class critique as well as a race-based critique. Now, we can criticize King. He wasn't strong enough in his critique of patriarchy. He certainly was not strong enough in his critique of homophobia or transphobia. We can learn from him in terms of his shortcomings, that he was not perfect. No individual, no movement, no institution will ever be perfect. That we have to have an endless criticism, a relentless criticism, but we build on the best of those who came before. That's the key.
If we can take it back to, you know, your ethical dimensions of Marxist thought, you wrote that in 1980, 81?
Well, the dissertation was done in 1980, and then the book was published in 91. But you're right, I finished in about 1980.
You said that it was a call for historical assessment and political reading of our morality and morale, and to shake people out of cynicism and nihilism. So since that you've written that, you know, we're, you know, in an age of misinformation. How do you think people reading of history and the morality of history that we can take moral lessons from, how do you think that compares to when you were writing the essay?
Well, you know, it's twofold. I mean, on the one hand, we've got more people who are willing to look at the world through the lens of the doings and sufferings and struggles of poor and working people. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, we've got more misinformation. We've got more lies that are just out there parading as if they're truths. So that we've really got we got two different worlds, as it were. We got the best and the worst.
Do you think that there's less of an emphasis on historical knowledge today than there was maybe 10?
That's a good question. You know, it's hard to say, my brother. It's hard to say. I mean, I have been blessed to teach for 44 years now, and I'm such a historicist. I always begin with historical context. I always begin with the circumstances and conditions under which we find ourselves that we have no control over, but we can, in some sense, shape and mold. So we can change the world, but not under conditions of our own choosing, as Marx says. I do see both a hunger and a thirst for a history among the younger generation. And in classes, history, I think, is taken much more seriously in the specific way that I was talking about. But on the other hand, too, you know, you got so many lies out there. You've got so much misinformation out there. You got so much myopia and short-sightedness and truncated perspectives out there. So that for me, it's hard to really measure how far we've come.
Professor West, I really, really do appreciate, and I want to reiterate that again, I really appreciate the taking time to speak to me. I know that things are moving fast in your world, and I hope you're staying safe in this pandemic. And I really do appreciate you taking the time out.
But I salute your 100th episode. I'm telling you, Brother Barry's in the house doing wonderful work, my brother. You stay strong though, man.